continued, removing his spectacles and looking frankly at Renee with his bright green eyes. They were made greener still by his green plaid suit. I will anticipate your other questions. First, I've made all the necessary arrangements with Mr. Rutger at the orphanage. We have considerable skills and resources here and can do many things you might not expect. And second, on a more solemn note, no, you won't be able to contact Miss Pernomo again. I'm afraid the urgency of our mission and its necessary secrecy forbids it. It is for Miss Pernomo's protection as well as your own. But if all goes well, which is, of course, our most desperate hope, you will see her again. Indeed, if our mission is to succeed, it must do so very quickly. And so, with luck, your reunion will be sooner rather than later. Renee nodded again, though not quite as bravely as before. He glanced away to hide the tears in his eyes. He had thought this might be the case, but it still saddened him to think he might not ever again share a cup of tea with Miss Pernomo, or attempt to tell her, in his limited Tamil, about his adventures. He was sad at the thought of what lay ahead, yes, and more than a little afraid. "I'm sorry, Renee," said Mr. Benedict with a quiver in his voice. Renee didn't look at him just yet. He kept his eyes averted until he had composed himself, which he did with a few deep breaths and a quick swipe of his tearful eye. When he felt sufficiently recovered, he turned back to Mr. Benedict, who was sound asleep in his chair. Before Renee could rise and tiptoe from the room, however, Mr. Benedict's eyes popped open, and he laid a hand on Renee's arm to stop him. "Forgive me," he said, clearing his throat and running his fingers through his unkempt hair. "Please stay just a moment longer. I want to ask you something." "I wasn't asleep long, was I? I trust I haven't kept you up." "No, sir, only a minute or two." "Ah, good. Usually it is only a minute or two, but occasionally it's longer. And then, for my question." "Yes, sir?" "It regards the chess problem from the first test. You, Renee, happen to be the only child ever to answer the question correctly, and I should like to hear your explanation for it. The board clearly shows that only the black pawn is out of its starting position, while all the other pieces and pawns rest on their original squares. Yet, according to the rules of chess, the white player must always move first. Why then did you say the position was possible?" "Because the white knight may have changed its mind." "The white knight?" "Oh, yes, sir. The pawns can only move forward, never backwards, so none of the white pawns could have moved yet. And the bigger pieces are trapped behind the pawns because only knights can jump over things, so they couldn't have moved yet either. But a white knight might have opened the game by jumping out in front. Then, after a black pawn was moved, the knight returned to its original square. So it looks like the white player never moved at all." "Bravo, Renee. You're quite correct. Now tell me, would you consider this a good move?" "I'm no great chess player, but I would say not. By starting over, the white loses the advantage of going first." "Why then do you think the white player might have done it?" Renee considered. He imagined himself moving out his knight only to bring it back where it had started. Why would he ever do such a thing? At last he said, "Perhaps he doubted himself." "Indeed," said Mr. Benedict, "perhaps he did." "Thank you, Renee. You've been kind and very patient, and I'm sure you're ready for a night's sleep. I'll see you at breakfast, bright and early." Renee rose and went to the door, but there he hesitated. He looked back. Mr. Benedict had replaced his spectacles and lowered himself onto the floor again, was again leaning against the desk, and had taken up a book. His eyebrows rose unexpectedly when he noticed the boy lingering. "Yes, Renee?" "Mr. Benedict, sir, have you read all the books in the house?" Mr. Benedict smiled, glancing fondly about at the many books in his study before looking at Renee again. "My dear boy, what do you think?" Bright and early, Mr. Benedict had said, and indeed it was early, but it was far from bright. As the children rose and went down to the dining room, not knowing where else to meet, rain was slashing against the windows. When, groaned in the chimneys, and odd drafts sent papers flying from desktops and skittering across floors. The blackened sky outside seemed to creep gloomily into the house, dimming the lamps and lengthening their shadows, and along with the howling chimneys was heard the growling of thunder, low and menacing and close at hand, as if a tiger prowled the dark rooms beyond their walls. From time to time the lamps flickered with thunder, and once, just as the children were taking seats at the table, they went out entirely. The room was dark only for a few moments, yet when the lamps came back to life, Milligan stood before the children with a pitcher of juice, having appeared out of nowhere. Constance shrieked. The other children jumped. Milligan sighed. Filling their juice glasses, he said, "Rhonda's coming with toast and eggs. Number 2's stopping the leak in her bedroom wall, but she'll fetch Mr. Benedict when she's done." "Milligan, may I have some milk, please?" Kate asked cheerily. She'd been awake longer than anyone, and already bathed and dressed in fresh clothes. Rhonda had given her, and, apparently unaffected by the storm, was in such a better mood than the others. Without doubt, she was in a better mood than Milligan, who nodded glumly and said, "Anything else?" "You wouldn't have any tea, would you, Milligan?" asked Renee. "And perhaps a little honey?" "And candy?" asked Constance. "No candy for breakfast," Milligan said, leaving the room. Rhonda appeared with a tray of wheat toast, eggs, and fruit. "Good morning, everyone," she said. "Quite a bit of weather we're having, isn't it? On a day like this, you have to set something on every stray sheet of paper if you don't want a draft carrying it off. A map of Stonetown Harbor passed me in the hall just now, and on the stairs I found a grocery list I misplaced 2 weeks ago." "Leaks in the wall and drafts in every room," Constance grumbled. "You should have these things fixed." "Leaks and drafts aren't priorities, I'm afraid," Rhonda said. "Our project, which is now your project too, has required every spare moment, and all our resources have gone toward the research and investigation and the tests. Constance, will you pass the juice pitcher, please?" "No," the girl replied, crossing her arms. "Perhaps you'll be less cranky after you've eaten," Rhonda said, getting the pitcher herself. At this, Constance's pudgy, rosy cheeks grew redder still, so that her wispy blonde hair seemed almost white in contrast, and her pale blue eyes shone bright as stars. Rhonda noticed this and said, "Constance, I had no idea how lovely your eyes were until just now. They're spectacular." This compliment, somehow upsetting Constance, kept her quiet for some time. Milligan returned with the milk, a pot of tea, and a jar of honey. Mumbling something to Rhonda about being on duty, he left without another word. "What does he mean by that?" Sticky said. "On duty. Milligan is our, well, for lack of a better word, our bodyguard. He has other tasks, but his first duty is to make sure we are safe. Of course, until now, we haven't been in direct danger, but now that you're here, I'm sorry, I don't mean to alarm you. The important thing is that he's here to protect you." "Protect us from what?" Renee asked. "I'll let Mr. Benedict explain all that to you when he comes down. The main rule is you must never leave the house without Milligan's company. Inside the house, you're quite safe. We have defenses here. The maze, for example, wasn't just a neat test. It's the only entrance. And this reminds me, all the arrows in the maze may point to the stairway, which isn't helpful if you're trying to leave the house. That's another reason you should never go without Milligan. We have a special way of opening the front door. You'll remember it has no inside knob, and Milligan knows the maze like the back of his hand." "I've always thought that was a funny expression," Kate said, "because how well do people really know the backs of their hands? Honestly, can anyone here tell me what the back of your hand actually looks like?" They were all contemplating the backs of their hands when Mr. Benedict came in, followed very closely and attentively by number 2, who no longer wore her yellow suit, but had changed into a comfortable pair of yellow coveralls, so that she still looked every bit the pencil. She stuck close to Mr. Benedict until he had greeted everyone and taken his chair, after which she swooped up the platter of toast and eggs, accidentally jostling Rhonda in the process. "Pardon me," she said, embarrassed. "Not at all," said Rhonda. To the children she said, Number 2 is always hungry because she never sleeps. A person needs a great deal of energy to stay awake all the time, and thus a great deal of food. It also makes me somewhat nervous and irritable, I'm afraid, said number 2. She proceeded to eat the crusts off her toast by turning it around and around, taking tiny, rapid bites. You never sleep? Kate asked, after watching this curious procedure a moment. Number 2 swallowed. Oh yes, I do, but only a little. Do we make a fine pair? Said Mr. Benedict, pouring himself a cup of tea. I can't stay awake, and number 2 can't go to sleep. He started to laugh, then cut himself short, apparently not wanting to risk it. By the way, Rhonda, have you seen my map of the harbor? It appears to have escaped the study. It drifted by me in the hallway, Rhonda said. I placed it by the bell under the Swiss book on electron position accelerators. Thank you. Now, children, speaking of the bell, do you all remember where it is on the second floor landing? If you ever hear the bell ringing, I want you to gather on the landing immediately. It will only be rung in case of emergencies, so don't delay. Drop what you're doing and go there at once. Understood? The children nodded uneasily. All this talk of danger and emergencies without explanation was beginning to wear on them. I'm sorry to put you ill at ease, Mr. Benedict said, and I haven't much to say to comfort you. I can finally offer some answers to your questions, however, so who wishes to begin? All right, we'll stop right there. We'll stop right there. Stop right there! All right, people.